Eleanor Whitmore thought money could protect her from anything, until one catastrophic night stripped away everything she thought she knew about power, privilege, and the people she'd spent years looking right through. When a devastating flood forces the wealthy CEO to seek shelter in the modest home of Marcus Hill, a janitor she'd never bothered to notice, she discovers that the man emptying her trash cans might just hold the key to everything her heart has been missing. But as Eleanor's perfectly curated world crumbles around her, and her mother's shocking family secret threatens to destroy any chance at happiness, she'll have to choose between the safe life she's built and a love that could cost her everything she's worked for. What happens when a woman who controls everything meets a man who sees right through her walls? And will Eleanor have the courage to fight for love when her own family turns against her? If you're watching this incredible story unfold, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from, because this journey of love, transformation, and finding home in the most unexpected places is just getting started. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the city lights flicker to life 30 floors below. Her reflection stared back. Sharp blazer, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about where her next meal would come from. You really believe that? The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor turned to face David Chen, her business partner, and the only person who dared challenge her these days. He sat across from her mahogany desk, his expression somewhere between amused and concerned. Believe what? Eleanor smoothed her skirt and settled into her leather chair. That money doesn't protect you from real life. David leaned forward. You just said anyone can adapt to any situation if they're tough enough. Eleanor's laugh came out sharper than intended. Because it's true. People make excuses. They blame circumstances instead of taking control. Easy to say when you've never faced real hardship. The words stung more than they should have. Eleanor had worked hard to build her company from the ground up. She'd earned everything she had. Hadn't she? I could handle any life, she said, her voice steady. Rich or poor, it doesn't matter. It's about mindset. David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he smiled, not the kind that reached his eyes. Want to test that theory? What do you mean? A bet, something private between us. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. There's a conference in town this weekend. Hotels will be packed, and I happen to know your building's having water pressure issues. Eleanor frowned. So? If something happened to your apartment, say a major leak that made it unlivable for a week, you couldn't just throw money at the problem. No luxury hotels, no friends with guest houses. You'd have to find real housing, the kind regular people use. That's ridiculous. Nothing's going to happen to my... It's a hypothetical, David cut her off. If something did happen, could you really adapt? Could you live like someone who doesn't have your resources? Eleanor's pride flared hot in her chest. Of course I could. Then prove it. David's smile widened. If your apartment becomes unlivable in the next month, you can't use your money to solve the problem. No 5-star hotels. No calling in favors from rich friends. You find housing the way a normal person would, through your company's employee resources or public options, for 1 full week. And if nothing happens, then you win. And I'll admit you're right about people making excuses. Eleanor stood and extended her hand. Deal. They shook on it, and David gathered his papers. I'll see you Monday, Eleanor. Try to have a quiet weekend. After he left, Eleanor stayed at her desk longer than usual, reviewing quarterly reports that could have waited until morning. The city grew quieter as late evening settled in, but she felt restless. David's words echoed in her mind, though she couldn't pinpoint why they bothered her so much. By the time she finally headed home, it was past 10 o'clock. The parking garage beneath her luxury building was nearly empty, her heels echoing off the concrete walls. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt longer than usual, and she found herself checking her reflection in the polished doors. Her condo greeted her with familiar silence. Marble countertops gleamed under recessed lighting, and the view of the harbor stretched endlessly beyond her living room windows. Everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Perfect, controlled, and utterly predictable. Eleanor kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than most people made in a day. She settled onto her white leather sofa and tried to shake off the strange mood that had followed her home. The sound came at 11:43, a steady drip that seemed to echo from somewhere above. Eleanor looked up at the ceiling, frowning. The dripping grew faster, more insistent, and then she saw the first dark stain spreading across the white plaster. She grabbed her phone and dialed building maintenance, but the after-hours recording told her to call back during business hours unless it was a life-threatening emergency. The stain grew larger as she watched, and the dripping turned into a small but steady stream. Eleanor ran to her linen closet for towels, but by the time she returned, water was pooling on her hardwood floors. She called the emergency maintenance number again, this time staying on hold until a tired voice answered. "This is Ray. What's the problem?" "There's water coming through my ceiling. A lot of water." Ray sighed. "What floor you on?" 23. "I'll be up in 10 minutes. Don't touch any electrical outlets near the water." Eleanor paced her living room, watching helplessly as the leak spread. Her expensive furniture sat like islands in a growing lake, and she could hear Ray's footsteps in the hallway before he knocked. The maintenance man looked exactly like someone who got called out at midnight. Tired, irritated, and wearing a uniform that had seen better days. He assessed the damage with the kind of professional calm that came from dealing with emergencies regularly. "Pipe burst upstairs," he said after 20 minutes of investigation. "Looks like it's been leaking into the walls for a while before it broke through to your unit." "How long to fix it?" Ray shook his head. "This isn't a quick patch job. We're talking major repairs, drywall replacement, floor refinishing, probably some electrical work too. You can't stay here tonight." Eleanor stared at him. "What do you mean I can't stay here? Lady, look around. Half your living room's underwater, and that ceiling could come down any minute. Building insurance will put you up somewhere until we get it sorted out. How long will that take?" "Week, maybe 2 if we run into complications." Eleanor's mind raced. A week. The bet. David's knowing smile flashed through her memory, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the water damage. "I need to pack a bag," she said quietly. Ray nodded. "Make it quick. I gotta shut off the water to this section. And once I do that, you're locked out until tomorrow." Eleanor moved through her bedroom mechanically, throwing clothes into a leather suitcase without really seeing what she grabbed. The wet carpet squished under her bare feet, and she could hear water still dripping in the living room. 20 minutes later, she stood in the hallway with her suitcase, watching Ray seal her door with yellow tape. The fluorescent hallway lights felt harsh after the warm ambiance of her home, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was homeless. Eleanor sat in her car in the building's parking garage, staring at her phone. Every hotel within 30 miles showed no vacancy. David had been right about the conference. She could probably call in favors, find someone willing to let her crash on a couch or in a guest room, but that would mean admitting she needed help. More importantly, it would mean losing the bet. Her pride wrestled with practicality as the dashboard clock ticked past 1 a.m. She could call David right now, admit he was right, and find a comfortable place to sleep, but something stubborn and fierce inside her refused to give up so easily. Eleanor started her car and drove home to her empty apartment building, parking in a guest spot she'd never needed before. She'd figure this out in the morning, after she'd had time to think clearly. She reclined her driver's seat as far as it would go, pulled a jacket from her back seat over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Sleep came in uncomfortable fragments, broken by the sound of delivery trucks and the steady hum of early morning traffic. By 7 o'clock, Eleanor gave up and headed to the office coffee shop she'd never actually been inside, despite walking past it every day for 3 years. The barista looked surprised to see someone in a $1,000 suit ordering a basic coffee at dawn, but Eleanor was too tired to care about appearances. She needed caffeine and a plan, in that order. Her reflection in the coffee shop window showed exactly what she felt like. Rumpled, exhausted, and completely out of her element. The Eleanor Whitmore who'd made that confident bet yesterday felt like a stranger. At 8:30 sharp, Eleanor knocked on the HR director's door. Patricia Williams had worked for the company longer than anyone else, and if there were employee resources for housing emergencies, she would know about them. "Eleanor," Patricia said, looking up from her computer with surprise. "You're here early. Everything all right?" "I need to ask about emergency housing options for employees." Eleanor sat down without being invited. "Do we have any company resources for situations like apartment damage?" Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "We do have one option. The company owns a short-term housing unit for employees dealing with emergencies. Things like fire damage, flooding, temporary relocations. It's basic, but it's available." Eleanor felt a surge of relief. "Perfect. How do I arrange to use it?" "Well," Patricia said slowly, "it's currently occupied by an employee who's using it temporarily while his permanent housing situation gets resolved. But he might be willing to share the space if you explained your circumstances." "Share?" Eleanor's relief evaporated. "What do you mean, share?" "It's a 2-bedroom unit. Marcus Hill from our maintenance staff has been staying there for the past month while he looks for a permanent place. He's a good employee, very reliable, very respectful. I could ask if he'd be comfortable with a temporary roommate." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Marcus Hill. She'd seen him around the building. Quiet, always in maintenance coveralls, always polite when their paths crossed in elevators or hallways. She'd never really thought of him as a person with problems or housing needs. He was just part of the building's background, like the security guards or the cleaning crew. "I'll need to think about it," Eleanor said carefully. Patricia nodded. "Of course. But Eleanor, if you don't mind me saying, Marcus is a good man. He's been with us for 5 years, never missed a day of work, always helps out when other departments need something. If you decide to approach him, I think you'll find him very reasonable." Eleanor thanked Patricia and left the HR office feeling like the world had tilted sideways. She'd expected a simple solution, a company apartment she could use alone until her place was fixed. Instead, her only option was sharing space with a man she'd barely noticed despite working in the same building for years. The irony wasn't lost on her. Yesterday, she'd claimed she could adapt to any situation, and now she was facing the prospect of living with someone whose life she'd never bothered to consider. Eleanor spent the rest of the morning in her office, catching up on emails and trying to pretend everything was normal. But every time she saw Marcus emptying trash cans or fixing something in the break room, her stomach tightened with an emotion she couldn't quite name. At lunch, she found herself following him to the maintenance room in the building's basement. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and machine oil, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She knocked on the open door, and Marcus looked up from a clipboard he'd been writing on. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, standing up straighter. "Something I can help you with?" Up close, Eleanor realized she'd never really looked at Marcus before. He was tall, with dark skin and careful eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. His work uniform was clean and pressed, and his hands looked like they knew how to fix things that were broken. "I need to talk to you about something," Eleanor said. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus gestured to a plastic chair near his workbench. "Sure. What's going on?" Eleanor sat down and tried to find the right words. The maintenance room felt like a different world from her corner office. Practical, honest, real, in a way that made her feel suddenly fragile. "My apartment flooded last night," she began. "Major damage. I can't stay there for at least a week." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's rough. Insurance covering a hotel? It's complicated." Eleanor took a breath. "Patricia mentioned you're staying in the company's emergency housing unit. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not exactly suspicion, but a new wariness. Yeah, temporarily. I was wondering. Eleanor hated how uncertain she sounded. Would you be willing to share the space? Just until my place is fixed. I know it's an unusual request. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself really looking at his face for the first time. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, but right now his expression was unreadable. Why me? He asked finally. I mean, you could probably stay anywhere. Nice hotel. Friend's place. Why would you want to share a basic apartment with someone you don't know? The question was fair, but Eleanor couldn't explain about the bet without sounding foolish. My options are limited right now, she said simply. And Patricia says you're trustworthy. Marcus leaned back against his workbench, studying her face. It's a small place, 2 bedrooms, but we'd be sharing a kitchen, living room, bathroom, and I keep regular hours, up early, home by 6, pretty quiet. That sounds fine. I'd want some ground rules, Marcus continued. Clear boundaries about space and privacy. And this would be temporary. I'm looking for my own place. Eleanor nodded quickly. Of course. Whatever you need. Marcus was quiet again, and Eleanor realized she was holding her breath. The absurdity of the situation hit her. She was asking a man she barely knew for a place to sleep, and her entire sense of control depended on his answer. I'll think about it, Marcus said finally. Give me until end of day? That's fair. Eleanor stood to leave, then hesitated. Marcus, why are you considering this? He looked at her with those careful eyes. Everyone needs help sometimes, even people who usually don't think they do. Eleanor left the maintenance room feeling like she'd been gently called out on something she couldn't quite name. The rest of the afternoon crawled by, and she found herself checking her phone every few minutes, even though Marcus had said he'd give her an answer by end of day. At 5:45, her office phone rang. Ms. Whitmore, it's Marcus. I'll share the space with you, but I want to be clear about the arrangement. Eleanor's relief was so strong, it surprised her. Of course, whatever you think is best. Separate bedrooms and we respect each other's privacy. We split household expenses while you're there. Groceries, utilities, whatever. And we both keep the place clean. That sounds reasonable. Good, I'll text you the address. You can come by around 7 if that works. After Marcus hung up, Eleanor sat in her empty office trying to process what had just happened. In less than 24 hours, she'd gone from confident CEO to woman without a home, asking a near stranger for shelter. The bet that had seemed so simple yesterday now felt like stepping off a cliff. Eleanor packed her car with the few belongings she'd managed to grab from her apartment, plus some extra clothes she kept at the office for overnight business trips. The address Marcus had texted led her to a modest apartment complex about 15 minutes from downtown, the kind of place she'd driven past hundreds of times without really seeing. The building was clean but basic, with small balconies and practical fixtures, instead of architectural flourishes. Eleanor climbed to the 2nd floor and found apartment 2B, her heart beating faster than it should have been. Marcus opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been watching for her car. He was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of his work uniform, and somehow that made everything feel more real. Come on in, he said, stepping aside. The apartment was exactly what he'd described, small but tidy, with basic furniture and no wasted space. The living room held a couch, coffee table, and small TV, while the kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. Everything was clean and organized, but it was clearly a temporary space rather than a home. Your room's down here, Marcus said, leading her to a short hallway. Bathroom's there, and my room's at the end. The walls are thin, so we'll probably hear each other moving around. Eleanor's designated room contained a single bed, small dresser, and one window that looked out at the parking lot. It was smaller than her walk-in closet at home, but it was clean and had a door that closed. "This is perfect," she said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. Marcus nodded. "I'll let you get settled. I usually eat dinner around 7:30 if you want to join me, but no pressure." He disappeared into his room and closed the door with a quiet click, leaving Eleanor alone with her suitcase and the sudden reality of her situation. She sat on the narrow bed and looked around at walls that weren't hers, in a space that belonged to someone she barely knew. For the first time since the leak started, Eleanor allowed herself to admit she was scared. Not of Marcus. Patricia had been right about him seeming trustworthy, but of everything else. She was completely out of her element, dependent on someone else's kindness, with no idea how to navigate this new version of her life. Outside her window, other residents of the complex were coming home from work, people in uniforms and sensible clothes, carrying grocery bags and talking on phones about ordinary problems. Eleanor watched them and realized she'd never paid attention to how most people actually lived. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Whitmore? I'm making spaghetti if you're interested. Nothing fancy." Eleanor's stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since the coffee shop pastry that morning. "That sounds wonderful. And please, call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," Marcus repeated, and she could hear him testing out how her name sounded in his voice. "Dinner'll be ready in 15 minutes. Eleanor unpacked her suitcase quickly, hanging her work clothes in the small closet and putting her toiletries in the bathroom medicine cabinet next to Marcus's practical supplies. Everything about the space was different from what she was used to. Functional instead of beautiful, shared instead of private, borrowed instead of owned. When she emerged from her room, Marcus was stirring sauce at the stove while pasta bubbled in a pot. The smell made her realize how hungry she actually was, and how foreign it felt to have someone else preparing her food. "Can I help with anything?" she asked. Marcus glanced at her over his shoulder. "There's salad stuff in the fridge if you want to throw something together." They worked in the small kitchen without talking much, moving around each other carefully in the limited space. Eleanor found herself paying attention to small things. How Marcus checked the pasta by actually tasting it instead of timing it. How he automatically handed her a dish towel when her hands got wet washing lettuce. How he moved with the kind of economy that came from being comfortable in small spaces. Dinner was simple. Spaghetti with meat sauce, basic salad, water from the tap instead of imported bottles. They sat across from each other at a small table that barely fit in the corner between kitchen and living room, and Eleanor realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a meal someone else had cooked without paying for it. "This is really good," she said, and meant it. Marcus smiled slightly. "My grandmother's recipe. Nothing complicated. You're close to your family?" "Was. She passed a few years ago." Marcus twirled spaghetti around his fork with practiced ease. "What about you? Family around here?" Eleanor thought about her mother and her pristine house across town, probably wondering why Eleanor hadn't called to check in. "My mother lives here. We're not as close as we used to be." Something in her voice must have warned Marcus not to push, because he just nodded, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the polite maintenance worker she'd barely noticed with the man sitting across from her, sharing his grandmother's recipe with a stranger. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said as they finished eating. "Sure." "Why did you say yes? To me staying here, I mean." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because everyone deserves help when their life falls apart, and because you asked instead of demanded." The words hit Eleanor harder than they should have. When had anyone ever doubted that she would demand rather than ask? When had she become the kind of person who inspired that assumption? "Thank you," she said quietly. "For this?" "All of it." Marcus stood to clear the dishes. "It's just temporary. We'll both figure out our situations and move on." Eleanor helped with cleanup, learning where things went in cabinets that weren't hers, drying dishes with towels that smelled like different detergent than she was used to. The domestic routine felt strange and somehow intimate, like playing house with rules she didn't understand. As evening settled in, they sat in the living room watching the news, something Eleanor realized she rarely did anymore, usually getting her information from curated reports or business channels. Marcus's presence beside her on the small couch was both comfortable and unsettling, and Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of the sound of his breathing, the warmth of another person in the quiet space. "I should let you get some rest," Marcus said during a commercial. "Tomorrow's a workday." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't tired so much as wired from the strangeness of everything. "Good night, Marcus." "Good night, Eleanor." She lay in the narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds. Marcus moving around his room, neighbors talking in the hallway, the building settling around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Marcus's breathing eventually slow and deepen, and the knowledge that someone else was sleeping just feet away felt both reassuring and terrifying. Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had changed in less than 48 hours. Yesterday, she'd been in complete control of her life, confident in her ability to handle anything. Tonight, she was lying in a stranger's apartment, dependent on his kindness, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. The strangest part was that Marcus had been right there all along, emptying her office trash, fixing broken things in her building, existing in the background of her carefully controlled world. She'd never wondered about his life, his housing situation, his grandmother's recipes. She'd never seen him as fully human. Now, as she drifted toward sleep in his temporary home, Eleanor wondered what else she'd been missing while she lived in her tower of certainty. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to being the person she'd been before everything fell apart. Eleanor woke to the sound of running water and realized she wasn't in her own bed. The events of the previous day came rushing back as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, and for a moment, she felt completely lost. Through the thin walls, she could hear Marcus moving around, getting ready for work with quiet efficiency. Her phone showed 6:15 in the morning. At home, she would have hit snooze twice and rolled out of bed at 7, relying on her coffee maker's timer and a closet full of perfectly coordinated outfits. Here, she felt uncertain about everything: when to use the bathroom, whether she could make coffee, how to exist in someone else's routine without getting in the way. The shower shut off, and Eleanor heard Marcus's bedroom door open. She stayed in bed, listening to his footsteps in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of breakfast being prepared. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Eleanor, I'm heading to work. There's coffee made if you want some." "Thank you," she called back, her voice rough with sleep. The apartment felt different after Marcus left, quieter, but also emptier in a way that surprised her. Eleanor had lived alone for years and cherished her solitude, but this felt like abandonment rather than independence. She padded to the kitchen in her pajamas and found a half-full coffee pot with a note. "Mugs in cabinet above sink. Help yourself to anything in fridge. M." The coffee was stronger than what she usually drank, and the simple kindness of the note made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Eleanor sat at the small table where they'd shared dinner, looking around at Marcus's temporary life with new eyes. Everything was functional but impersonal. No photos on the walls, no books or personal items that might tell her who he really was. The refrigerator held basic supplies: milk, eggs, sandwich meat, vegetables that looked like they were bought with specific meals in mind rather than wishful thinking. It was the kitchen of someone who cooked out of necessity rather than pleasure, but who took care with even simple things. Eleanor showered quickly, hyper-aware of using someone else's space and hot water. Her work clothes felt too formal for the modest apartment, but they were armor she needed for facing the day. As she applied makeup in the bathroom mirror, she caught herself wondering what Marcus saw when he looked at her. If he saw the confident executive she projected, or something more fragile underneath. At work, Eleanor tried to fall back into her normal routine, but everything felt slightly off-kilter. During her morning meeting, she found herself thinking about Marcus somewhere in the building. probably fixing things that kept her comfortable world running smoothly. When Vanessa brought her lunch, Eleanor realized she'd never wondered where her assistant went when she left each evening, whether she lived alone, what her kitchen looked like. "Is everything all right?" Vanessa asked, setting a salad on Eleanor's desk. "You seem distracted today." Eleanor almost told her about the apartment situation, then stopped herself. How could she explain that she was learning to see her own building differently, noticing people who had always been invisible to her? "Just tired," Eleanor said instead. "Long night." The afternoon dragged by, and Eleanor found herself watching the clock more than usual. The thought of returning to Marcus's apartment created an odd mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She didn't know the rules yet, whether she should buy groceries, how to navigate the evening routine, what level of conversation was expected or wanted. At 5:30, she gathered her things and headed for the parking garage, passing Marcus in the lobby as he finished his shift. They nodded politely, like acquaintances rather than temporary roommates, but something in his expression suggested he was as uncertain about the arrangement as she was. Eleanor stopped at a grocery store on the way back to the apartment, wandering the aisles with no clear plan. At home, she usually ordered meals from expensive restaurants or heated up frozen entrees that cost more than most people spent on groceries for a week. Here, surrounded by families with careful shopping lists and college students counting change, she felt exposed and clueless. She finally settled on ingredients for a simple pasta dish, remembering her grandmother cooking when Eleanor was very young, before wealth had insulated her family from such domestic concerns. The memory felt distant and precious, like something she'd lost without realizing it. Marcus was already home when Eleanor returned, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and she noticed he'd changed out of his work uniform into jeans and a sweater that brought out the warm brown of his eyes. "How was your day?" he asked, gathering up his papers. "Fine. Busy." Eleanor held up her grocery bags. "I thought I could cook tonight, if that's okay." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Surprise, maybe, or caution. "You don't have to do that." "I want to." Eleanor realized it was true. "I mean, if you don't mind sharing your kitchen." Marcus smiled slightly. "It's not really my kitchen, just a kitchen I'm borrowing." Eleanor unpacked her groceries while Marcus cleared the table, and they moved around each other in the small space with the same careful politeness as the night before. But tonight felt different somehow, less like strangers being courteous and more like people trying to figure out how to exist together. "Can I help?" Marcus asked as Eleanor read the pasta package instructions twice. "I think I can handle it." Eleanor filled a pot with water, then looked at the stove controls with uncertainty. "Actually, how do you get this burner to work?" Marcus reached around her to adjust the gas flame, and Eleanor caught a brief scent of soap and something else, maybe aftershave, or just the clean smell of someone who worked with his hands. His presence at her shoulder felt warm and steady, and when he stepped back, she missed it. "There you go," he said. "Just give it a few minutes to boil." They worked together quietly, Eleanor cooking while Marcus prepared a salad with vegetables he'd bought earlier. The domestic routine felt natural in a way that surprised them both, though neither mentioned it. When dinner was ready, they sat across from each other again, but the awkwardness of the first night had softened into something more comfortable. "This is really good," Marcus said after trying Eleanor's attempt at chicken Alfredo. "Don't sound so surprised." Eleanor laughed, then realized it was the first time she'd laughed genuinely in days. "Okay, maybe sound a little surprised. I don't cook very often." "What do you usually do for dinner?" Eleanor thought about her typical evening. Takeout eaten alone while reviewing reports, or business dinners at restaurants where she knew which fork to use but had forgotten how food could be about more than nutrition. "Work, mostly. Eat while I work." Marcus nodded but didn't comment, and Eleanor found herself wanting to explain further. "I know how that sounds. Like I don't have a life outside the office." "Do you?" The question was asked gently, without judgment, but it hit harder than criticism would have. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. I thought I did. But sitting here, I'm not sure what that life actually looked like. They ate in thoughtful silence for a while, and Eleanor noticed details she'd missed the night before. How Marcus cut his food into neat, even pieces. How he listened carefully when she spoke. How he seemed comfortable with quiet in a way that didn't demand filling. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said as they finished eating. Sure. What do you do when you're not at work? I mean, how do you spend your time? Marcus considered the question. Read mostly. Watch old movies. I used to play basketball at the community center, but I haven't found one near here yet. You read a lot? Every night. Helps me wind down. Marcus cleared their plates. What about you? What do you do to relax? Eleanor realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd done something purely for relaxation. I used to read, before work took over everything. What kind of books? Everything, fiction, biographies, poetry sometimes. The admission felt vulnerable, like revealing a secret about herself. I haven't picked up a book for pleasure in probably 2 years. Marcus disappeared into his room and returned with a paperback novel, its cover worn soft from handling. You can borrow this if you want. It's nothing fancy, just a good story. Eleanor accepted the book like it was something precious. The pages fell open naturally to spots where Marcus had obviously read and reread favorite passages, and she could see penciled notes in the margins, thoughtful observations about characters and plot turns. Thank you, she said, meaning more than just the book loan. They spent the evening in the living room again, Marcus reading a different book, while Eleanor started the one he'd lent her. The story drew her in quickly. A simple tale about people facing ordinary struggles with grace and humor, and she found herself forgetting where she was, losing track of time in a way she hadn't experienced since college. Good book, Marcus asked during a commercial break in the news. Really good. I'd forgotten how it feels to read something just because I want to. Marcus smiled. Books are cheaper than therapy and usually more helpful. Eleanor laughed. Is that your philosophy on life? One of them. Marcus marked his place in his book. My grandmother used to say that reading other people's stories helps you understand your own. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Raised 4 kids by herself after my grandfather died. Worked 2 jobs. Never complained about anything. Marcus's voice carried deep affection and respect. She would have liked you. What makes you say that? She always said people are more than what they show on the surface. She'd look at you and see whatever's underneath all that polish. Eleanor felt exposed and comforted at the same time. What do you see? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor realized she was holding her breath waiting for his answer. Someone who's forgotten how to be just a person instead of a position. The words should have stung, but instead they felt like relief. Like someone had finally said something true about her life. Eleanor looked around the small apartment, at the simple furniture and functional space, and tried to remember when she'd last felt as comfortable as she did in this borrowed living room. I should let you get some rest, Marcus said eventually, but neither of them moved to get up. Marcus? Eleanor closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages. Why are you staying here? In the company housing, I mean. What happened to your regular place? Marcus's expression grew careful again. Rent got raised beyond what I could afford. Landlord decided the neighborhood was getting too valuable for working people. I'm sorry, that's awful. It happens. I'll find something else. Marcus stood and stretched. Just taking longer than I expected. Eleanor wanted to ask more questions. About how long he'd been looking, whether the company housing was a step down from where he'd lived before, what it felt like to be displaced from your home through no fault of your own. But something in his posture suggested the conversation was over. Good night, Marcus. Good night, Eleanor. Sleep well. Eleanor lay in bed reading until almost midnight, losing herself in the story Marcus had shared with her. The characters felt real in a way that reminded her why she'd once loved books so much. They were messy and flawed, and trying their best with imperfect information, just like actual people. Through the wall, she could hear Marcus settling into bed, and again the knowledge of his proximity felt both strange and comforting. Tomorrow would be another day of navigating this temporary arrangement, figuring out how to share space with someone whose life she was only beginning to understand. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning established a rhythm. Eleanor woke to the sound of Marcus's alarm, lay quietly while he showered and prepared for work, then emerged after he left to find coffee already made and another small note. This time just, "Have a good day. M." But somehow that simple courtesy meant everything. At work, Eleanor found herself noticing Marcus differently. When he emptied trash cans in her office, she looked up from her computer and said good morning. When she saw him in the elevator, she asked how his day was going. Small interactions, but they felt significant in ways she couldn't fully explain. Her assistant Vanessa noticed the change. "You seem more present lately," she said during their afternoon meeting. "Less stressed." Eleanor considered telling her about the living situation, but something held her back. The time with Marcus felt private, separate from her professional life in a way she wanted to protect. That evening, Eleanor arrived at the apartment to find Marcus in the kitchen again. But this time he was making something more elaborate, chicken with vegetables that smelled like herbs and garlic. The kitchen felt warmer than usual, more lived in. "Smells amazing in here," Eleanor said, hanging up her jacket. "My grandmother's Sunday dinner recipe. Figured we could use something special." Marcus glanced at her over his shoulder. "How was your day?" "Better than yesterday." Eleanor washed her hands at the sink. "What can I do to help?" They cooked together more easily this time, Marcus giving Eleanor small tasks while he managed the more complicated parts of the meal. She found herself watching his hands as he worked. Competent, careful, moving with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. "Necessity, mostly. When you're taking care of yourself from a young age, you learn quick." "Taking care of yourself?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "My mom worked a lot. 3 jobs sometimes. I learned to cook so there'd be something decent to eat when she got home." Eleanor felt a stab of something. Guilt, maybe. Or recognition of how different their childhoods had been. That's a lot of responsibility for a kid. It was just life. Everyone's got something they have to figure out. Dinner was even better than the night before, and Eleanor found herself savoring not just the food, but the whole experience. The conversation that came easier now. The way Marcus listened when she talked about her day. The comfortable silences that didn't need filling. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said as they finished eating. "Always." "Do you like your job? Working maintenance, I mean." Marcus considered the question. "It's honest work. I fix things that are broken, help people when they need it. There are worse ways to spend your time. But is it what you want to do? Want is complicated." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I wanted to be a teacher, actually. Got a degree in education, student taught for a semester." "What happened?" "Budget cuts. New teacher positions got eliminated right when I graduated. I needed work, took the maintenance job temporarily while I looked for teaching positions." Marcus's smile was rueful. Temporary turned into 5 years. Eleanor felt a pang of loss for dreams deferred. For the students who might have benefited from Marcus's patient attention and obvious intelligence. "Are you still looking? For teaching jobs, I mean." "Sometimes. But it's hard to start over in your 30s, especially when you've been out of the classroom for so long. It's never too late to change course." Marcus looked at her curiously. "Is that what you're doing? Changing course?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "What do you mean?" "This whole situation, Living here, cooking dinner, reading books for fun again. Seems like you're trying something different. Eleanor thought about his words as they cleaned up together. Was she changing course? Or just temporarily displaced from her real life? The question felt more complicated than it should have. That night, they sat in the living room reading again, but the silence felt more companionable than it had before. Eleanor noticed Marcus making notes in his current book, another paperback novel, well-worn like everything he seemed to own. "Do you write?" she asked. "Just notes to myself, things that make me think." Marcus showed her a page covered with neat handwriting. "Helps me process what I'm reading." Eleanor looked at his notes. Thoughtful observations about character motivation, questions about themes, connections to other books he'd read. The margins were filled with an obviously active mind engaging deeply with ideas. "You really should be teaching," she said. "Maybe someday." Marcus closed the book. "What about you? Ever think about doing something else?" "Like what?" "I don't know." "What did you want to be when you were a kid?" Eleanor tried to remember ever wanting to be anything other than successful. "I honestly can't remember having other dreams. I was always focused on business, on building something, proving I could succeed." "But what makes you happy? Besides work?" The question hung in the air between them, and Eleanor realized she couldn't answer it. When had she last done something purely because it brought her joy? When had she last felt genuinely content rather than just accomplished? "I don't know," she said finally. "I think I forgot how to think about happiness instead of achievement." Marcus nodded like he understood. "Achievement is easier to measure." "Exactly. Happiness is too." Uncertain. They sat quietly for a while, and Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Marcus. In the soft light from the reading lamp, his face looked thoughtful and kind. She wondered what he'd been like as a child, whether he'd always been this patient and careful with people. "Marcus?" she said eventually. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For letting me stay here. For sharing your space with a stranger." "We're not strangers anymore," Marcus said simply. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the apartment's heating system. "No, I guess we're not." "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Marcus." Eleanor lay in bed thinking about the evening's conversation, about dreams deferred and happiness versus achievement. Through the wall, she could hear Marcus moving around quietly, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to say goodnight from the same room instead of through a wall. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead, it felt like a natural progression of whatever was developing between them. Not romance exactly, not yet, but something deeper than friendship, more intimate than mere roommates sharing space. For the third night in a row, Eleanor fell asleep, feeling like she was learning something important about herself. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted the lesson to end. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Eleanor woke to the sound of Marcus preparing for work, emerged to find coffee waiting, and spent her evenings learning to navigate shared space with someone who seemed to understand the value of both conversation and comfortable silence. Friday evening, Eleanor arrived home. She'd started thinking of the apartment as home, though she tried not to examine that too closely, to find Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with grocery store flyers spread in front of him. "Planning the week's meals?" Eleanor asked, hanging up her jacket. Marcus looked up with a slight smile. "Trying to make my food budget stretch. It's like a puzzle sometimes." Eleanor glanced at the flyers, seeing careful calculations written in Marcus's neat handwriting. Numbers that represented choosing between fresh vegetables and meat, or buying generic brands instead of name brands. It was a reality she'd never had to consider, and seeing it laid out so practically made her feel naive and sheltered. "Can I contribute?" she asked. "To groceries, I mean. I've been eating your food all week." "You don't have to." I want to. Eleanor sat down across from him. We're sharing everything else. It only makes sense. Marcus studied her face for a moment. All right. But we plan meals together, shop together. No just throwing money at it. Deal. They spent the next hour mapping out meals for the following week, and Eleanor discovered that Marcus approached grocery shopping the way she approached business planning, with strategy, research, and careful attention to getting the best value. Watching him work, she realized there was an intelligence in managing limited resources that her abundance had never required her to develop. You're really good at this, she said, as Marcus calculated the total cost of their planned meals. Practice. Marcus folded up the flyers. You learn to make everything count when you don't have much margin for error. Saturday morning, they went grocery shopping together. Eleanor's first time in a regular supermarket in longer than she could remember. She usually had groceries delivered or picked up prepared meals from expensive stores that catered to people who viewed cooking as inconvenience rather than necessity. Marcus moved through the store with purpose, checking prices, comparing options, choosing items with the kind of care that came from understanding their real value. Eleanor found herself watching him read nutrition labels and calculate cost per pound, seeing intelligence applied to everyday survival in ways her MBA had never taught her. Try these, Marcus said, handing her a peach from the produce section. They're perfectly ripe. Eleanor bit into the fruit and tasted sunshine and sweetness that made her close her eyes. Oh my God, this is incredible. When did you last eat a really good piece of fruit? Eleanor thought about it. I honestly can't remember. Everything I eat usually comes pre-cut in plastic containers. Marcus picked out several more peaches, then moved to the leafy greens. Food tastes better when you choose it yourself, when you can see where it came from. They worked their way through the store together, Marcus teaching Eleanor things she'd never thought to learn. How to choose the best vegetables, which cuts of meat offered the most value, why store brands were usually just as good as name brands. It was practical education that made Eleanor realize how disconnected she'd become from basic aspects of living. This is fun, Eleanor said as they loaded bags into her car. Grocery shopping? Learning how to do things I should have figured out years ago. Eleanor started the car. You're a good teacher. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Thanks. It's been a while since anyone said that. Back at the apartment, they cooked lunch together. A simple stir-fry that Marcus made look effortless, while Eleanor struggled with timing and coordination. But instead of making her feel incompetent, Marcus's gentle corrections and encouragement made her want to try harder. Better, he said, as Eleanor managed to flip vegetables without sending them flying across the kitchen. You're getting the hang of it. Only because you're patient with me. Everyone learns differently. You just need to trust yourself more. Eleanor realized he wasn't just talking about cooking. That afternoon, they took a walk around the neighborhood. Something Eleanor suggested impulsively, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd walked anywhere without a specific destination. The area around Marcus's temporary apartment was different from Eleanor's usual environment. Working class, diverse, with small businesses and community gardens tucked between residential buildings. I live 10 minutes from here, and I've never seen any of this, Eleanor said, as they passed a community center where kids were playing basketball in the outdoor court. Different worlds, Marcus said simply. How do you mean? Marcus gestured around them. This, regular people living regular lives, working jobs that pay enough to get by, raising kids, trying to build something stable. He looked at Eleanor carefully. Not everyone lives in corner offices and luxury condos. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. I know that. Do you? Marcus's voice was gentle but direct. Because sometimes the way you talk about things, like you're surprised people can be smart or interesting if they don't have money, it makes me wonder what you actually see when you look around. The words stung because they were true. Eleanor had spent so long insulated by wealth and professional success that she'd forgotten how to see people instead of positions, lives instead of categories. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been living in a bubble for so long I forgot there was anything outside it." They walked in silence for a while, and Eleanor found herself really looking at the neighborhood for the first time. Children playing in small front yards, elderly people sitting on stoops talking to neighbors, teenagers helping unload groceries from a car. Normal life. The kind she'd somehow managed to avoid, despite living in the middle of it. "Marcus?" she said, as they turned back toward the apartment. "Yeah?" "That day you agreed to let me stay. You said everyone deserves help when their life falls apart. Did you mean your life had fallen apart too?" Marcus considered her question. Not fallen apart exactly. More like, gotten smaller than I planned. Because of housing? Or other things too? Housing was just the latest thing. Marcus kicked a small stone along the sidewalk. Sometimes you realize you've been so focused on surviving that you forgot about actually living. Eleanor understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Eleanor felt something shifting between them. The careful politeness of roommates was evolving into something warmer, but more complicated. She found herself noticing details about Marcus that had nothing to do with practical cohabitation. The way he hummed quietly while he cooked, how his eyes crinkled when he found something genuinely amusing, the gentle competence in everything he did. "Eleanor," Marcus said as they sat down to eat, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Why don't you have someone? I mean, you're successful, obviously smart, attractive." Marcus paused. "I just wonder why you're alone." The question caught Eleanor off guard, partly because she'd been wondering the same thing about him. "Work, I guess. I put everything into building my career, and somewhere along the way I forgot about building anything else." "No one you've been serious about?" Eleanor thought about the men she'd dated, other executives, ambitious professionals who understood her drive but never challenged it, never asked her to be more than successful. A few people, but nothing that lasted. Eleanor took a sip of water. "I think I chose people who fit my image of what my life should look like instead of people who actually made me happy." "What would make you happy?" The question was becoming familiar between them, but tonight it felt different, more immediate, more connected to the present moment, rather than abstract philosophy. "This," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "This feels like happiness. Cooking together, talking about real things, not having to perform or impress anyone." Marcus's expression grew serious. "Eleanor." "I know," she said quickly. "I know this is temporary. I know we barely know each other. I'm not saying anything needs to change, that's not what I was going to say." Eleanor looked up from her plate, suddenly nervous about what she might see in his face. "I was going to say this feels like happiness to me too, and that scares me." "Why does it scare you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're going to go back to your real life eventually. Back to your corner office and luxury condo and people who understand your world. And I'll still be here, looking for an apartment I can afford, and trying to figure out how to make ends meet." Eleanor wanted to argue, to say that wasn't how she saw their situation, but something in Marcus's voice stopped her. There was hurt there, old and careful, like he'd learned not to hope for things that seemed too good to be true. "Has someone made you feel that way before?" she asked gently. "Like you weren't good enough for their real life?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "A few times. Different situations, but the pattern's the same. When someone has options, they usually choose the easier one." Eleanor felt a stab of anger on his behalf, followed immediately by the uncomfortable recognition that she might have been guilty of similar assumptions in the past. How many people had she dismissed without really seeing them? How many Marcuses had been invisible to her, because they didn't fit her narrow definition of worthwhile? "I can't speak for whoever hurt you before," Eleanor said carefully. "But I can tell you that us here, right now, doesn't feel temporary to me. It feels like the most real thing I've experienced in years." Marcus studied her face. "What happens when your apartment is fixed? When you can go back to your old life?" Eleanor realized she hadn't thought about that in days. The idea of returning to her empty condo, her solitary routines, her carefully controlled environment felt less like going home and more like regression. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I guess I haven't been thinking that far ahead. Maybe you should." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "Because I can't do this if it's just an experiment for you. If you're just trying something different until you get bored or your real life calls you back." The conversation felt suddenly weighted with implications neither of them had been ready to acknowledge. Eleanor looked around the small apartment that had become more of a home in 1 week than her condo had been in 3 years, and tried to imagine explaining this to her mother, her colleagues, her carefully curated social circle. "You think I'm just playing house?" she said. "I think you're a good person who's learning things about herself. But I also think you live in a world where someone like me doesn't really fit." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she could hear her mother's voice in her head, horrified, critical, focused on image and appropriateness above all else. Could she really build something real with Marcus while navigating that kind of pressure and judgment? "I don't know how to do this," Eleanor admitted. "I don't know how to figure out what's real versus what's just reaction to being out of my element." Marcus nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Then maybe we should be careful. Take things slow. See what develops naturally instead of forcing anything." Eleanor felt both relief and disappointment. "So we're friends, roommates who get along well." "We're 2 people figuring things out," Marcus said, without putting pressure on it to be anything specific. They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, both aware that something important had shifted between them. The easy intimacy of the past few days now carried an undercurrent of possibility and uncertainty that changed the weight of every interaction. Later, as they sat in the living room reading, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Marcus and wondering what he was thinking. The book in her hands, another loan from his collection, might as well have been blank pages. All her attention was focused on the man sitting 3 feet away, close enough to touch, but suddenly feeling much more distant. "I'm going to turn in early," Marcus said eventually, closing his book with deliberate care. "Good night," Eleanor said, but Marcus paused at the hallway entrance. "Eleanor, what I said earlier, about being careful, that doesn't mean I don't care about you. It means I care enough to want to do this right." After he disappeared into his room, Eleanor sat in the quiet living room trying to process everything that had been said and implied. The smart thing would be to maintain appropriate distance, treat this as temporary housing arrangement, and return to her old life when her apartment was ready. But as she looked around at the space where she'd felt more like herself than she had in years, Eleanor realized she didn't want to be smart about this. She wanted to be brave enough to figure out what was growing between them, even if it meant risking comfort and certainty for something unknown. The question was whether Marcus would be willing to take that risk with her, and whether either of them could navigate the real-world complications that would come with building something together across the lines that typically separated their lives. Eleanor went to bed that night with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that whatever happened next, she didn't want to face it alone. Sunday morning arrived with the sound of rain against the windows, and the knowledge that Eleanor's week of temporary housing was nearly over. She'd received a text the night before from her building's management company. Repairs would be complete by Tuesday, and she could move back in Wednesday morning. The news should have felt like relief, but instead, it sat in her stomach, like something heavy and unwelcome. Eleanor lay in bed, listening to Marcus move around the kitchen, making coffee with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, and tried to imagine returning to her empty condo alone. When she finally emerged, Marcus was sitting at the table with his laptop open, scrolling through apartment listings with the kind of focused determination she recognized from her own business research. The sight of him planning his next move made everything feel more real and more temporary. Any luck? She asked, pouring coffee from the pot he'd left for her. A few possibilities. Nothing great, but I can't stay here forever. Marcus glanced up at her. Speaking of which, heard anything about your repairs? Eleanor sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Tuesday. I can move back Wednesday. Marcus nodded, but something in his expression grew careful again. That's good. You'll be glad to get back to your own space. Eleanor wanted to say she wouldn't be glad at all, that the thought of leaving felt like losing something precious she'd only just discovered. Instead, she found herself asking, "What will you do? After I leave, I mean." Keep looking for a place. The company housing was always meant to be short-term. They sat in silence for a moment, both aware they were discussing logistics to avoid talking about the emotional reality of their situation. The easy intimacy of the past week now felt fragile, like something that might disappear if they acknowledged it too directly. Want to do something today? Eleanor asked impulsively. Since it's our last full day as roommates? Marcus looked up from his laptop. What did you have in mind? I don't know. Something normal. Something people do together on Sundays. Marcus smiled slightly. You want to learn how regular people spend their weekends? I want to spend time with you without thinking about what happens next. The honesty in her voice seemed to surprise them both. Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the careful attention she'd come to recognize. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. No expensive restaurants or activities that cost more than a regular person makes in a day. Deal. An hour later, they were walking through the local farmers market under a shared umbrella, moving slowly between stalls of fresh produce, handmade crafts, and food vendors. Eleanor had passed signs for the market dozens of times, but never stopped, always too busy rushing between scheduled appointments to notice what was happening in her own neighborhood. Try this, Marcus said, handing her a small cup of soup from a vendor who seemed to know him by name. The soup was rich and warming, with vegetables that tasted like they'd been grown in actual soil rather than industrial greenhouses. Eleanor closed her eyes and savored flavors that seemed connected to seasons and weather in ways her usual meals never were. It's incredible, she said to the vendor, an elderly woman with flour-dusted hands. What's your secret? Time, the woman said simply. Everything good takes time. Marcus bought them each a full bowl, and they found a covered picnic table where they could eat and watch the market activity around them. Families browsing together, elderly couples selecting vegetables with practiced care, young parents chasing toddlers between stalls. Normal life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. I live 5 minutes from here, Eleanor said, watching a father lift his daughter to see over the crowd. How did I never know this existed? Different priorities, Marcus said without judgment. You were focused on other things. What was I focused on? Eleanor realized she was asking him to help her understand her own life. Marcus considered the question while finishing his soup. Success, proving yourself, building something that would last. But what's the point of building something if you never stop to enjoy it? Good question. What's your answer? Eleanor watched a teenager help his grandmother select apples, their easy affection obvious in the gentle way he guided her to the best fruit. I think I forgot that success was supposed to be a means to something, not an end in itself. What was it supposed to be a means to? Happiness, security, connection. Eleanor turned to look at Marcus directly. Things I've felt more of in the past week than in the past 3 years. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him weighing her words against his own careful caution. Eleanor, I know what you're going to say. That this is just temporary, that I'll go back to my real life, that people like us don't usually make sense together. Do we make sense together? The question hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor thought about the past week, cooking simple meals, sharing books, learning to exist comfortably in small spaces. The profound relief of being seen and accepted without performance or pretense. "I think we make more sense than anything else in my life," she said quietly. Before Marcus could respond, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically, then felt her stomach drop as she read the name on the screen. "Who is it?" Marcus asked, noticing her expression change. "My mother. She wants to come by this afternoon to check on me since she hasn't heard from me all week." Eleanor stared at the phone, trying to calculate how to handle the situation. Her mother knew about the apartment flooding, but assumed Eleanor was staying at a hotel or with friends from her social circle. The thought of explaining Marcus, the shared living situation, the growing feelings she was still figuring out herself, made Eleanor feel suddenly exhausted. "You could tell her you're not available," Marcus suggested gently. "You don't know my mother. When Lydia Whitmore decides she needs to check on something, she doesn't take no for an answer." Eleanor typed a quick response saying she was staying with a friend and would call later, but even as she sent it, she knew it would only delay the inevitable. Her mother would keep pushing until she got the information she wanted. "Problem solved?" Marcus asked. "Problem postponed." Eleanor put her phone away. "She'll want details eventually. About where I'm staying, who I'm with, whether the situation is appropriate." Something in Eleanor's tone made Marcus look at her more carefully. "You're worried about what she'll think, about me. It's not that simple. Isn't it?" Marcus's voice was quiet but direct. "Your mother's going to have opinions about you living with a black maintenance worker, and you're not sure how to handle that." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from the uncomfortable accuracy of his observation. "My mother has very specific ideas about my life, about who belongs in it and who doesn't." "And you agree with those ideas?" "No." The answer came quickly, but then Eleanor hesitated. "But I also don't know how to fight them without losing my family." Marcus nodded like he'd expected that answer. "I get it. Family pressure is real. But Eleanor, if you can't stand up for what you want, how do you expect to build anything real?" They walked back to the apartment in thoughtful silence. The morning's easy intimacy replaced by the weight of real-world complications. Eleanor found herself noticing things differently. The way other interracial couples navigated public spaces, the subtle looks and assumptions that Marcus probably dealt with regularly, the privilege she'd never had to think about, because it had always protected rather than limited her. Back at the apartment, they spent the afternoon reading and trying to recapture the comfortable routine they'd developed. But the conversation about Eleanor's mother had introduced a tension that couldn't be easily dismissed. They were both aware that their private bubble was about to be tested by outside pressures neither of them fully understood yet. At 4:00, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she recognized the sharp, authoritative sound of her mother's knock, 3 precise raps that demanded immediate attention. "That's her," Eleanor said quietly to Marcus, who was sitting on the couch with a book. "Want me to go to my room?" Eleanor looked at Marcus, this kind, intelligent man who had welcomed her into his temporary home, shared his food and stories, and careful optimism with a stranger. The thought of hiding him from her mother felt like betrayal. "No," she said, standing up straighter. "Stay." Eleanor opened the door to find her mother exactly as expected, perfectly dressed, professionally made up, and radiating the kind of controlled disapproval that could make grown adults feel like scolded children. Lydia Whitmore stepped into the apartment before Eleanor could decide whether to invite her in, her eyes already scanning the small space with unconcealed assessment. "Eleanor, thank goodness. I was so worried when you wouldn't tell me where you were staying." Lydia's gaze landed on Marcus, who had stood politely when she entered. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." The pause before company carried volumes of implication. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety, the old pattern of trying to manage her mother's reactions and expectations. "Mom," This is Marcus Hill. Marcus, my mother, Lydia Whitmore. Marcus stepped forward with his hand extended. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Lydia shook his hand briefly, her smile polite but distant. The expression Eleanor recognized as her mother's way of being courteous to service workers, or anyone else she considered outside her social sphere. Mr. Hill, are you a friend of Eleanor's? We work in the same building, Marcus said simply. Eleanor needed a place to stay while her apartment's being repaired, and I had an extra room. Eleanor watched her mother process this information, saw the moment when Lydia connected Marcus's plain clothes and modest apartment with his mention of working in Eleanor's building. The subtle shift in her posture said everything about what conclusions she was drawing. How charitable of you, Lydia said, her tone carrying just enough sweetness to mask the condescension. It's so important to help those less fortunate when we can. Eleanor felt something hot and angry flare in her chest. Mom, I'm sure Eleanor has been very grateful for your assistance, Lydia continued, addressing Marcus with the kind of patronizing kindness she might use with a helpful hotel employee. It's refreshing to meet people who understand their role in helping others. Marcus's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw something tighten around his eyes. She realized with growing horror that her mother was speaking to him like he was performing a service rather than offering friendship, like his kindness was expected rather than generous. Actually, Eleanor said, her voice sharper than intended, Marcus has been helping me more than I've been helping him. I'm learning a lot. Lydia's eyebrows rose slightly. Learning what, dear? Eleanor looked around the small apartment, at the kitchen where she'd learned to cook simple meals, the living room where she'd rediscovered the pleasure of reading, the space where she'd felt more at peace than in her expensive condo. How to live, she said simply. Lydia's laugh was light and dismissive. Oh, sweetheart, this is hardly living. This is making do with circumstances. There's a difference. Eleanor felt Marcus stiffen beside her, and she realized her mother's words weren't just dismissive of their situation. They were dismissive of his life, his choices, his worth as a person. The casual cruelty of it made Eleanor feel sick. I should let you two talk privately, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. I'll be in my room. Marcus, you don't have to. It's fine, Eleanor. Your mother came to see you. After Marcus disappeared down the hallway, Lydia settled onto the couch with the kind of relieved sigh that suggested she'd been holding her breath in his presence. Well, she said, that's certainly an interesting situation you've gotten yourself into. What do you mean? Lydia gestured around the apartment. This, Eleanor, living in someone else's space, depending on the charity of, well, someone who's obviously very different from us. Different how? Oh, please. Lydia's tone grew impatient. Don't be naive. He's a maintenance worker, for heaven's sake. Sweet enough, I'm sure, but hardly appropriate as a long-term association. Eleanor felt her mother's words like physical blows. He's been incredibly kind to me. More than that, he's intelligent, thoughtful, interesting. I'm sure he is. But Eleanor, you have to think practically. What would people say if they knew you were living with the building's janitor? What would that do to your professional reputation? I don't care what people would say. Lydia's expression grew sharp with concern. You should care. You've worked too hard to build your life to throw it away on some misguided attempt to connect with the common people. Is that what you think this is? Some kind of sociological experiment? Isn't it? Lydia leaned forward. Eleanor, you're confused right now. Your life got disrupted, and you're mistaking gratitude for something deeper. But this man lives in a world that has nothing to do with yours. What happens when you realize you have nothing in common besides a temporary housing arrangement? Eleanor thought about the past week, the conversations over simple dinners, the books they'd shared, the way Marcus had seen through her professional facade to something more real underneath. Her mother's dismissal felt like an assault on the most genuine connection she'd experienced in years. We have more in common than you think, Eleanor said quietly. Like what? He reads paperback novels and you read quarterly reports. He shops for groceries based on price. You have assistants who handle those details. He works with his hands. You work with your mind. Where exactly is the common ground? Each point felt designed to highlight the distance between Eleanor's life and Marcus's, but instead of convincing her, they made Eleanor realize how narrow her world had become. When had she started thinking that intelligence only counted if it came with credentials? When had she decided that someone's worth was determined by their income or job title? The common ground is that he sees me, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the intensity in her voice. He listens when I talk. He challenges me to think about things differently. He makes me want to be better than I am. Lydia was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor's face with the kind of clinical assessment that had always made Eleanor feel like a problem to be solved. You're infatuated, Lydia said finally. It's understandable. He's probably very different from the men you usually meet, and there's always something appealing about what seems exotic or authentic. But infatuation fades, Eleanor, and when it does, you'll be left trying to build a real relationship with someone who can't understand your life. Maybe I don't want my old life. The words surprised Eleanor as much as they surprised her mother. Lydia's expression shifted from concern to alarm, and Eleanor realized she'd revealed more than she'd intended. What does that mean? Eleanor looked around the small apartment, thinking about the week she'd spent here. The simple routines, the easy conversations, the absence of performance and pretense. The feeling of being enough exactly as she was, without additions or improvements or careful management of image. It means maybe I've been living the wrong life for the wrong reasons, Eleanor said. Maybe success isn't worth it if it means being alone and disconnected from everything real. Lydia stood up abruptly. Eleanor, you're scaring me. This isn't like you. You don't throw away everything you've built for some romantic fantasy about simple living and noble workers. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm trying to figure out what actually matters. What matters is stability, security, building something that lasts. Lydia's voice grew urgent. Eleanor, I've seen what happens when people make choices based on feelings instead of practical considerations. Your father and I almost made that mistake once. And thank God we came to our senses before we ruined everything we'd worked for. Eleanor stared at her mother, trying to parse what she'd just heard. What are you talking about? Lydia seemed to realize she'd said too much. Nothing. Ancient history. The point is, you can't let temporary circumstances derail your real life. But Eleanor was thinking about her parents' marriage, polite, functional, emotionally distant in ways that had shaped Eleanor's own assumptions about relationships. Had there been someone else once? Someone her mother had given up for practical reasons? Did you love him? Eleanor asked quietly. Love who? Whoever you gave up for Dad. Lydia's face went pale, then flushed with anger. That's completely inappropriate, Eleanor, and entirely beside the point. Is it? Because maybe the point is that I don't want to spend my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to choose what made me happy instead of what looked right on paper. They stared at each other across the small living room, and Eleanor could feel decades of careful distance and polite conflict crystallizing into something more fundamental. She was choosing between her mother's version of her life and something new that scared her, but felt true. I need you to leave, Eleanor said quietly. Eleanor, please. I need time to think, and I can't do that with you here telling me all the reasons I shouldn't trust my own feelings. Lydia gathered her purse with sharp, precise movements. This isn't over, Eleanor. You're making a mistake that will affect the rest of your life, and I won't stand by and watch you destroy everything you've worked for. After her mother left, Eleanor stood in the quiet apartment, feeling like she'd just fought a war in her own living room. The space felt different now, smaller, somehow tainted by her mother's judgment and assumptions. She knocked softly on Marcus's bedroom door. "It's safe to come out." Marcus emerged looking carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the hurt in his eyes that he was trying to hide. "Everything all right?" "No," Eleanor said honestly. Nothing about that was all right. They sat down on the couch together, and Eleanor tried to find words for everything she was feeling. Anger at her mother's casual dismissal of Marcus as a person, shame at her own failure to defend him more strongly, fear that maybe her mother was right about the impossibility of their situation. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for what she said, how she treated you. None of that was okay." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "She's not wrong about some things. We do live in different worlds. The question is whether that matters more than what we feel for each other." Eleanor looked at Marcus, really looked at him, trying to see past her mother's categories and assumptions to the man who had welcomed her with such generous kindness. He was watching her with careful attention, and she realized he was waiting to see which version of herself she would choose to be. "It doesn't matter to me," Eleanor said. "Different worlds, different backgrounds, different expectations. None of that changes how I feel about you. How do you feel about me?" The question was asked so gently that Eleanor knew he was giving her space to retreat if she needed to. Instead, she found herself leaning toward honesty that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Like I've been asleep for years, and you're the first person to help me wake up. Like everything good about myself is easier to access when you're around. Like home is wherever you are instead of wherever my stuff is." Marcus's expression softened, and Eleanor saw him make his own choice about which version of himself to be, cautious or brave, protected or open. "Eleanor," he said, reaching for her hand, "I think I'm falling in love with you, and I'm scared as hell about what that means for both of us." Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest, relief and joy and terror all mixed together. "I'm falling in love with you too, and I don't want to be careful anymore." They sat holding hands in the quiet apartment, both aware they were committing to something that would require them to navigate complicated territory with no clear map. But for the first time in either of their lives, love felt more important than safety, connection more valuable than control. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked. Eleanor thought about her apartment being ready Wednesday, about the choice between returning to her old life and building something new, about her mother's disapproval and the professional complications and all the practical reasons why this was complicated and difficult. Then she thought about morning coffee, made by someone who cared about her day, conversations over simple dinners, the feeling of being known and accepted exactly as she was. "Now we figure out how to make this work," Eleanor said. "Together." Outside, the rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the apartment windows. In the golden light, Eleanor could see their future stretching out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. Difficult but worth fighting for. They had found each other across differences that seemed impossible to bridge, and now they had to decide whether love was strong enough to help them build something real together. Eleanor thought about her grandmother's words that Marcus had shared. "Food tastes better when you choose it yourself." Maybe everything tasted better when you chose it yourself, including love, even when it came in forms you hadn't expected, from people your old life never would have allowed you to really see. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor was choosing with her heart instead of her head. And despite everything complicated that lay ahead, it felt like the first real choice she'd ever made.